Nobody talks about Walter Scull because Walter Scull made the mistake, in the spring of 1941, of writing down what he found. He had worked for the United States Post Office's Pneumatic Dispatch Division for 14 years by then. 14 years of descending before the rest of the city was awake into the tube rooms below Manhattan's postal stations, loading the cylindrical metal carriers, watching the pressure gauges, feeding the mail into a system most New Yorkers above ground had no idea existed beneath their feet. It was not glamorous work. It was the kind of work a city depends on absolutely and thinks about never. The underground machinery of ordinary life, noticed only when it failed, and the pneumatic system almost never failed. Walter Scull was good at his job, which in practical terms meant that his supervisors had little reason to think about him at all. That changed in March of 1941, when he filed an incident report describing a station room that did not appear on any operational map in the post office's possession, containing live pressure gauges, an active receiving port, and 14 pieces of mail addressed to streets that did not exist. Within a week, 3 separate supervisors at 3 separate levels of the organization had called him in. Within 2 weeks, his incident report had disappeared from the internal filing system. Within 8 months, Walter Scull had accepted what was described to him as an early retirement offer and moved to a house in Rockaway Beach, where he lived quietly for 37 more years and showed his notebooks to nobody. His granddaughter found them in a metal box under his workbench in 2003. She read them, sat with them for 4 years, and published excerpts in a small press journal in 2007. The piece received almost no attention. This is what those notebooks described. To understand what Walter Scull encountered, you need to first understand what the pneumatic mail system actually was, because the overwhelming majority of people alive today do not know it existed, and their ignorance is doing a great deal of quiet work in keeping this story where it is. In 1897, the United States Post Office Department completed construction of an underground pneumatic tube network beneath the streets of Manhattan. It was not a covert operation. It was covered in newspapers as an engineering achievement, celebrated by city officials, and described in Postal Service publications with something close to pride. The system ran 27 miles of pressurized iron tubing under the main arteries of the island, connecting post offices and relay stations from the Battery to Harlem in a continuous underground circuit. Cylindrical metal carriers, each one capable of containing several hundred letters, were loaded at one end of the system, sealed, and propelled through the tubes by compressed air at speeds of 30 to 35 miles per hour. The trip between stations that might take a surface vehicle 40 minutes in traffic took the pneumatic carriers under 4. At its operational peak, the system moved 600,000 pieces of mail per day without a single truck wheel turning anywhere. It ran for 56 years. In 1953, the post office shut it down, citing maintenance costs and the expanded capacity of motorized delivery. The tubes were sealed. The relay rooms were locked. The machinery, too expensive to remove and, at the depths involved, too difficult to excavate, was left exactly where it was. Most of it remains there today, underneath streets you have walked on, in rooms that no currently active Postal Service employee holds a key to. Drawing power from connections that several municipal engineers have noted on record are still, in a number of locations, technically live. This is the world Walter Scull worked inside, and it was not, even in 1941, a world that anyone at the surface level of the post office understood completely. New York City had been building things underground for nearly a century before the pneumatic system opened. The first subway didn't arrive until 1904, but the impulse to put infrastructure beneath the street had been active long before that. In 1870, a man named Alfred Ely Beach secretly constructed a pneumatic transit tunnel beneath Broadway, a fully functioning demonstration subway, built without permits by crews working at night and hauling debris out through a closed storefront, and revealed to an astonished public who had no idea the work had been happening beneath them for over a year. Beach's tunnel was ultimately blocked by political opposition and never extended, but it established something important about the relationship between New York City and its own underside. The city had a documented history of building things beneath itself that it didn't always put on the official maps. Not from any unified policy of concealment, but from the cumulative effect of 100 years of competing jurisdictions, shifting administrations, changing priorities, and the particular institutional tendency to document what serves current operations and let everything else drift into the background. The pneumatic mail system's relay rooms were part of that background. Scull's training had given him working knowledge of the route he maintained, its standard junctions, its pressure parameters, the specific sequence of valve positions and gauge readings that constituted a normal operating day. What it had not given him, and what he came to understand no one in his division had been given, was anything approaching a complete architectural understanding of the infrastructure he worked inside. The maps he had access to were functional maps, not comprehensive ones. They showed what the post office needed its workers to know. They did not necessarily show everything that was there. Walter Scull's route in 1941 ran between the Ansonia Station substation on the Upper West Side and the Central Dispatch Hub at the General Post Office on 33rd Street. He had maintained this route for 9 years without anything he would have described as unusual. He knew its rhythms and its sounds, and the specific pressure differentials that told him, before he checked a single gauge, whether the morning was going to be routine. The morning of March 7th was not routine. The pressure differential between the Ansonia substation and the 72nd Street relay point came back low. Not catastrophically, not a system failure, not a breach, but consistently and unusually low, in a pattern that suggested not a leak or a mechanical fault, but a distribution problem. Pressure going somewhere it wasn't accounted for in the standard calculations. Scull logged it, ran the standard diagnostics, and found nothing that explained it. Then he did what a man does after 14 years of knowing a system better than its paperwork does. He went down to look. The access shafts along the pneumatic route were narrow concrete descents, steel rungs set into the wall, dropping past the subway infrastructure level and the main utility conduits into the pressurized corridor where the tubes ran. Scull had made this descent dozens of times. He knew what was at the bottom, or believed he did. He descended at the 72nd Street access point with a work lamp and his incident log, expecting to find a faulty junction or a valve that had been left fractionally open by someone on the previous shift. What he found instead was a branch in the main tube line that he had never seen before, and that had no marking on any diagram in his possession. He writes about this moment with unusual care in his notebooks. He says he stood at the junction for what he estimates was several minutes before he did anything. He was not frightened, he writes. He was something more disorienting than frightened. He was certain he was wrong. 14 years of working this route, and he was standing in front of a junction he had walked past or descended past hundreds of times without seeing it. He checked the main line indicators twice to confirm his position. He was exactly where he thought he was. The branch was simply there, angled off the main tube at roughly 30 degrees, built in the same materials as everything around it, fitted with the same type of connectors that he identified from their style as original construction, somewhere between 1895 and 1905, by his estimation. This was not something recently installed. It had been there since the system was built. It was just not on any map he had ever been given. He followed it 40 meters to its end. The relay room he found there was small, comparable in dimensions to the other intermediate stations along his route. The same late 19th century institutional tile on the walls, the same gauge panel layout, the same configuration of pressure controls and loading infrastructure. But it was not like the other relay rooms in the one way that mattered most. It was not dormant. The gauges on the panel were live. The pressure in the receiving port was active, not residual bleed from the main line, but consistent and regulated. The kind of steady reading that indicated the room was connected to the pressure network in a way that was ongoing and functional. Someone or something was maintaining this room's connection to the system it was built into. and in the loading tray, the flat metal shelf where outgoing carriers were staged before dispatch, there were envelopes, 14 of them, loose, not bundled, not in a carrier, just sitting there in the tray, as though someone had sorted them and set them down and intended to come back. Scull picked them up and read the addresses. The envelopes were standard post office issue, the off-white stock the department had been using since the mid-1920s. The postmarks on 12 of the 14 were genuine domestic stamps, properly cancelled, the kind of marking that could only be applied at a post office facility with access to the standard cancellation equipment. The handwriting on all 14 was consistent, careful, deliberate, unhurried, not official, personal. These were not bulk mailings or official correspondence. Someone had addressed these envelopes by hand, one at a time. Every single one was addressed at a location in Manhattan. Street number, street name, borough, city, state, correctly formatted, completely standard, except that when Scull subsequently checked, and he checked carefully over multiple sessions, against multiple directories, not one of the 14 streets named in those addresses appeared anywhere, not in the current city directory, not in historical directories going back to the 1880s, not on the borough surveyor's maps, not in the registry of renamed or renumbered streets that the city maintained. 14 addresses, all following the correct formal structure of a New York City mailing address, all pointing to streets that the documented geography of Manhattan Island could not account for. The names were the same. Scull ran all 14 names against the Manhattan Residential Directory, the Commercial Registry, and through a contact at the city clerk's office, the Borough Death Registry extending back to 1870. 2 of the names appeared in the Death Registry, both deceased before 1895. The remaining 12 appeared nowhere in any record he was able to access, not as residents, not as business owners, not as registered voters, not as the deceased. 12 names that the city's documentation across a century of record-keeping had never encountered. He brought all 14 envelopes up with him. He wrote his incident report that evening. He described the junction, the room, the active gauges, the pressure readings, the mail. He attached the envelopes as physical evidence and submitted the report through the standard internal channels. He received a written acknowledgement of receipt. 3 days later his direct supervisor called him in. Misrouted dead letters, he was told. The junction was a known maintenance access point. The matter had been reviewed and filed. Scull asked which supervisor had authorized the access point to remain unmarked on route diagrams. His supervisor told him that question was above the scope of his role, and the meeting was over. 1 week after that, a second man, someone operating at a level of the post office hierarchy that Scull, in 14 years of employment, had never had direct contact with, sat across from him in a different office and had what was functionally the same conversation. Dead letters. Known access. Closed. When Scull asked about the active pressure readings in a room that was not connected to any official maintenance circuit, the man across from him looked at him for a moment without expression and told him he must have misread the gauges. 1 week after that, Scull went to the post office's internal records office and requested a copy of his incident report. The clerk checked the filing system twice and informed him that no report matching his description and reference number could be located. He had made a carbon copy the night he filed the original. He does not explain this decision in the notebooks. He seems to have done it the way a careful man does certain things without consciously identifying why. The carbon was at home. It stayed at home. Over the following 6 months he made 2 more formal attempts to have his report reinstated in the official record. Both were received and ignored. In October of 1941, a representative from the regional postmaster's office visited his station to discuss, at considerable length, the benefits available to a postal employee of his tenure who elected to retire before the standard age. He retired in November. He took the carbon copy and his notebooks and a single item he does not mention until the final entry of the last notebook, one of the 14 envelopes which he had kept separate from the others before submitting the rest as evidence. He writes that he never opened it. He writes that he thought about opening it many times over the following decades and always decided against it. He does not explain why. His final notebook entry, written approximately 2 years before his death in 1978, says only, "I think the address on it is where it was always supposed to go. I think if I opened it, it would have been written to whoever opened it. I am not sure I want to know what it says." His granddaughter found the envelope still sealed in 2003. She describes it in her 2007 publication as addressed in the same careful hand as the others, to a street name she could not locate, with a name in the recipient line she could not find in any record. She says she held it for a long time. She says she put it back in the metal box and has not opened it either. The pneumatic mail system's infrastructure is still underneath Manhattan. The post office has never publicly accounted for every relay room built at original construction. The municipal agencies responsible for subsurface mapping have stated, on multiple occasions and in multiple official contexts, that their documentation of the island's underground infrastructure is acknowledged to be incomplete. Walter Scull found a room that was built when the system was built, maintained in operational condition for at least 44 years after it was built, and stocked with mail addressed to a Manhattan that exists nowhere in the city's 2 centuries of meticulous record-keeping. Someone built it. Someone kept the pressure live. Someone put 14 letters in the tray, and either came back for them at some point after March 7th, 1941, or they are still sitting there in the dark, 60 feet below a street you might walk down this afternoon, addressed and waiting, pointing to a version of this city that doesn't appear on any map that was ever made available to the public. The last postmaster who delivered to the sealed level knew exactly what he found. He wrote it down. He told the truth about it. The organization that employed him spent 2 weeks making sure neither he nor the truth went anywhere. The envelope is still sealed. 43 years after Walter Scull decided not to open it, his granddaughter made the same choice. Some mail, it turns out, was never meant to be read by the person who found it.